A sociologist claims the probability that a person picked at random in Times Square in New York City is visiting the area is no more than 0.74. Jonah wants to test the claim. And we're going to start by doing two things. We want to identify the null hypothesis and we want to identify the alternative hypothesis. So let's write the statement given in the problem in mathematical form. That'll help us know whether we're dealing with the null hypothesis or the alternative. So here, the sociologist claims the probability is no more than 0.74. So in this case, the probability is a stand-in for proportion. Since we're talking about all the people in Times Square, if you pick someone randomly, the probability that the person picked at random in Times Square is visiting the area is no more than 0.74 is the same as the proportion being no more than 0.74, since the probability depends on how many people there are. Okay? So we're dealing with the population proportion, and it's saying it is no more than 0.74. So what does that mean? Well, no more means it cannot be more. Okay, so less than or equal to 0.74. It can be equal to, but it can be no more than 0.74. It can be less than, but not more. Now this statement has an equal to in it. That means this is a statement of the null hypothesis. The alternative hypothesis is the same statement, but it's the opposite. It's the opposite mathematical symbol. So instead of no more than 0.74, it's that the proportion is more than 0.74. Just take the opposite mathematical symbol. So over here, the null hypothesis is about the population proportion, and it's that it is less than or equal to 0.74. The alternative hypothesis is that the population proportion is more than 0.74. Okay? Now that we have that down, we need to identify the type 1 and type 2 errors. Okay? Now we've got a lot of statements here. So let's first identify what the actual errors are. Okay? So notice there's some keywords that are in bold here. So Jonah decides that the proportion of people in Times Square who are visiting is not more than 0.74, when in fact the proportion of people who are visiting is more than 0.74. So Jonah concluded that the proportion is not more than 0.74, but in fact the proportion is more. That's an error, right? Jonah drew the wrong conclusion. So A here is an error. We'll decide if it's a type 1 or type 2 error in a moment, but it is an error, so keep that in mind. Part B, almost the same statement, but now Jonah decides that the proportion is more than 0.74, and in fact it is more than 0.74. Notice this is not an error. Jonah made a conclusion. The actual fact is that his conclusion is correct, right? He concluded that the proportion is more than 0.74, and in actuality the proportion is more than 0.74. It's the correct outcome, okay? Part C, Jonah concluded the proportion is not more than 0.74, and in fact it is not more than 0.74. Again, that is not an error. He drew a conclusion, and the conclusion matched reality. That is the correct outcome. So B and C are the correct outcome. They are not errors. But part D, Jonah decides that the proportion is more than 0.74, when in fact the proportion is not more than 0.74. So what he concluded does not match reality. This is an error. So our two errors in this case are parts A and part D. Now we have to decide which is a type 1 error and which is a type 2 error. Okay? So remember, a type 1 error is when you reject the null and accept the alternative, but in fact the null is true and the alternative is false. Okay? So let's first identify our type 1 error. And it helps a little bit to write it out yourself. Okay? So for our type 1 error, it's when you accept the alternative. So you would say, you would conclude the alternative. So conclude the proportion is more than 0.74, but the proportion is actually not more than 0.74. So by the way, off to the side here, I'm looking at the table so that I can remember which is a type 1 and which is a type 2 error. It is easy to get them confused, so use your notes, use the tables and the resources available to you so you can make sure that you identify correctly which is a type 1 and which is a type 2 error. So I'm focusing on type 1 error, and I'm focusing on the alternative in this case. And in a type 1 error, we decide to accept the alternative when it is actually false. Okay? And so that's what I'm writing here. And notice that that is exactly part D. The proportion, we conclude that the proportion is more than 0.74 when in fact it is not more than 0.4. So the type 1 error is part D. Okay? Or is option D. Type 2 error. Type 2 error is when we do not accept the alternative hypothesis when actually it's true. Okay? So we conclude the proportion is not more than 0.74, but the proportion is more than 0.74. That would be a type 2 error. Okay? And that's exactly what option A is over here. Jonah concludes that the proportion is not more than 0.74, but actually he got it wrong. The proportion is actually more than 0.74. He rejected, or he did not accept the alternative. In fact, the alternative is true. So A is a type 2 error.